My 7-year-old daughter grabbed the hem of her sweater and pulled it up. My breath caught in my throat. Dark purple and yellow bruises painted her small ribs. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, her whole body trembling, her voice barely breaking a whisper as she said his name. Uncle Gregory. I gripped my phone with shaking hands and dialed my mother. I expected horror. I expected the fierce, protective rage of our family's billionaire matriarch. Instead, a dead silence hung on the line. Then came her voice, ice cold and perfectly steady. Keep your mouth shut and do not ruin this family's reputation. The dial tone buzzed against my ear. I'm 34 years old. I spend my days working as a 911 dispatcher. Panic, manipulation, and the absolute worst moments of people's lives are my daily soundtrack. My name is Kelly, and in that exact second, I understood my mother had just declared war on her own flesh and blood to protect a monster. By the next morning, the gaslighting campaign was in full swing. Gregory moved with terrifying speed, calling every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our expansive family tree. He played the deeply wounded, heartbroken uncle perfectly, telling them I was having a mental breakdown. He whispered that I was coaching Madison to invent these stories because I was a bitter, struggling single mother, desperate for a massive payout from the family trust. Eleanor provided the ultimate seal of approval. She completely severed my emergency financial accounts and sent a single decisive message to the family group chat demanding total isolation. Anyone who spoke to me would be cut off. My phone went completely dark. The notifications stopped. My entire support system evaporated overnight. I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the blank screen of my phone. The air in the house turned thick and suffocating. I remembered being 12 years old, sitting out of sight on the grand staircase of Eleanor's estate, listening to her tell her country club friends that I was the difficult child, the mistake, the one who never quite fit the family mold. Gregory was the golden boy, the untouchable heir. I was just the scapegoat. They crushed my spirit back then, spending 2 decades convincing me my voice held absolutely zero value. I gripped the edge of the kitchen island. The cold granite bit into my palms, grounding me. They expected me to crumble. They waited for me to crawl back to the estate gates, sobbing, begging for forgiveness. They forgot who I grew up to be. I deal with sociopaths, liars, and abusers for a living. I map out crises. I recognize the exact tone a predator uses when they believe they have permanently cornered their victim. Gregory and Eleanor thought they could use their billions to rewrite reality. I walked to the front door and slid the heavy metal deadbolt into place. I pulled every curtain in the house shut. I wiped the remaining moisture from my cheeks, sat down at my dining table, and opened my laptop. I stopped being the exiled daughter. I turned my own bloodline into an active crime scene. I sat at my dispatch console on the midnight shift. The glowing screen in front of me held a decade of local secrets. I bypassed the standard channels and pulled the archived 911 logs for Oak Creek Private School. Red flags lit up the monitor immediately. 4 separate child endangerment calls over the past 12 years. Every single one canceled mid-route by the local police chief. A name buried deep in one of the dismissed incident reports caught my eye. Margaret, the aunt who vanished from our family photos 10 years ago. I found her living in a cramped, dark apartment 2 states over. She looked like a ghost of the vibrant woman I remembered. I sat on her faded couch and slid a photograph of Madison's bruised ribs across the scratched coffee table. Margaret stared at the picture. The color drained completely from her face. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she walked to a floor safe hidden beneath a rug. She pulled out a thick, heavy envelope and dropped it in front of me. Inside lay a legally binding non-disclosure agreement. $2 million, the exact price my mother paid a decade ago to bury what Gregory did to Margaret's young son. Margaret backed away toward her bedroom. I'm taking the next flight to Montreal, she whispered, her voice tight with panic. If Eleanor finds out I gave you this, my life is over. Do not ever call me again. The heavy wooden door slammed shut in my face. I sat alone in my parked car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The envelope rested on the passenger seat, heavy with a sick, undeniable truth. People outside our world always wonder how a grandmother could look at her violently bruised granddaughter and choose to protect the monster who did it. They assume it's some twisted, unconditional motherly love for her son. It is not love. Eleanor protects Gregory because he is the golden face of her empire. Acknowledging his sickness means acknowledging a massive, irreversible stain on her flawless billionaire legacy. To a true narcissist, the bruises on my little girl's ribs cause less pain than a public blemish on the family crest. Eleanor would gladly sacrifice Madison on the altar of our public reputation without losing a single minute of sleep. She was not a mother protecting a child. She was a chief executive officer protecting a corporate asset. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. My mother wanted to protect her precious legacy. I decided it was time to burn it to the ground. I sent Gregory a single text message asking him to come over. He arrived exactly 20 minutes later, stepping through my front door, wearing his signature cashmere coat and an utterly relaxed, smug grin. He walked straight into my living room and stood by the window, surveying my small house like a king inspecting a peasant's hut. He fully believed I was ready to wave the white flag. He forgot what state we live in. The law here requires only one party to consent to a recording. The microphone on my Apple Watch was already capturing every single breath in the room. Gregory turned around and crossed his arms. "You really should have listened to Eleanor," he sighed, using our mother's first name like they were corporate partners. "You are making a mess, Kelly. A completely pointless mess." I kept my expression deadpan. "Madison has bruises on her ribs, Gregory." He rolled his eyes, utterly annoyed by the inconvenience. "We paid Margaret $2 million to make her kids' little stories go away. Do you honestly believe you can win against that kind of money or that kind of power?" He stepped closer, dropping his voice into a low, vicious whisper. "Keep pushing this and I will take Madison away from you. Eleanor has local judges on speed dial. You will be locked inside a psychiatric ward before the weekend." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the room. He stared down at me, waiting for the tears. He expected my knees to buckle. He expected the obedient, terrified little sister from a decade ago to beg for mercy. He made a fatal, arrogant miscalculation. When you threaten to rip a child from her mother's arms, you are no longer dealing with a compliant relative. You strip away every ounce of hesitation. You strip away the fear of losing an inheritance or a seat at the holiday table. You push a mother into a dark corner and she stops being a citizen bound by polite society. She transforms into an apex predator. You threaten my little girl, and I will not just fight back. I will gladly strike the match and watch our entire family tree burn to white ash. I forced the corners of my mouth up into a slow, chilling smile. I stepped aside and pulled the front door wide open. "We are done here," I said quietly. Gregory smirked, adjusted his expensive collar, and strode out into the afternoon sun. He walked to his car, absolutely certain he had won. I pushed the heavy door shut, looked down at my wrist, and saved the audio file. I was holding his legal death warrant. Now I just needed to get dressed for the Oak Creek anniversary gala. I emptied my emergency savings jar onto the kitchen counter. $2,400 in crumpled 20s, 50s, and hundreds. It was every single cent I had to my name. I shoved the paper stack into a plain manila envelope. Magic does not open doors in the real world. Desperation and cold, hard cash do. I drove to the Oak Creek anniversary gala. The parking lot was a sea of luxury cars, but I bypassed the grand entrance entirely. I slipped around back to the loading dock where a junior audiovisual technician leaned against the brick wall, smoking a cigarette and looking completely exhausted. I walked right up to him and pressed the thick envelope against his chest along with a small black flash drive. He blinked, glancing down at the money. "There is $2,400 in there," I said, keeping my voice dead even. "Press play at exactly 8 o'clock. Walk out this back door and do not stop driving. The FBI is raiding this family tonight, and you do not want to be standing here when it happens." He swallowed hard, shoved the envelope into his pocket, and gave me a single, stiff nod. I slipped into the back of the grand ballroom just minutes before the hour. Hundreds of the city's wealthiest elites sat at white-clothed tables, sipping expensive champagne. Up on the main stage, Gregory stood behind a crystal podium wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo, flashing his trademark brilliant smile. He was mid-sentence, delivering a passionate speech about family values and the sacred trust of shaping young minds. The clock struck 8. The microphone let out a sharp screech. Gregory tapped the mic, his smile faltering for just a fraction of a second. The massive projection screen behind him flickered. The slideshow of smiling students vanished. In its place, a high-resolution scan of Margaret's $2 million non-disclosure agreement blazed across the screen. Every signature, every damning clause magnified for 500 billionaires to read. Before the crowd could even process the document, the massive ballroom speakers crackled. Gregory's own arrogant, recorded voice boomed through the hall. "We paid Margaret $2 million to make her kids' little stories go away. Do you honestly believe you can win against that kind of money?" The silence in the room became violently heavy. I kept my eyes locked purely on Gregory. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His hands began to shake so violently, the crystal podium rattled. Thick beads of sweat broke out across his forehead. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic, breathless gasp escaped. The heavy microphone slipped from his trembling fingers and slammed onto the wooden stage with a deafening thud. The crowd erupted. Whispers turned into gasps, and gasps turned into shouts of pure, visceral disgust. Wealthy donors scrambled out of their chairs, physically backing away from the stage like Gregory carried a deadly plague. Across the room, Eleanor sat frozen at the head table. Her jaw hung slack, her pristine, arrogant posture completely collapsed. She stared up at the giant screen, her eyes wide with unmasked terror. The immaculate billion-dollar empire she sacrificed her own granddaughter to protect was shattering into a million unfixable pieces right in front of her face. I turned on my heel and walked out the double doors. The flashing red and blue lights painted my living room walls 24 hours later. I stood by the front window, holding Madison tightly against my side. At the end of my driveway sat my mother's sleek black Maybach. Its heavy engine purred in the quiet street. The windows remained tinted pitch black. She sat in the climate-controlled leather back seat, sipping sparkling water, letting her paid mercenaries do the dirty work. Heavy fists pounded against my front door. The local police chief stood on my porch alongside a woman from Child Protective Services. He held a piece of paper up to the peephole, a completely forged psychiatric evaluation. Eleanor paid her private concierge doctor to declare me dangerously unstable. She planned to drag my 7-year-old daughter out of my house in the middle of the night to permanently silence me. The chief raised his heavy boot to kick the door frame. He never completed the swing. The deafening shriek of sirens shattered the neighborhood. 3 massive black SUVs tore around the corner, jumping the curb and violently boxing the Maybach against the sidewalk. Men wearing tactical vests swarmed the lawn. The federal insignia on their jackets glowed under the streetlights. They completely ignored the local police chief on my porch. The lead agent marched straight to the luxury car and slammed a heavy fist against the tinted glass. My mother rolled the window down, her face twisting in pure arrogant outrage. The agent shoved a federal warrant for interstate wire fraud directly into her chest. She used a federally insured bank to wire $2 million to cover up a felony, making it a federal crime. The agents dragged her out of the vehicle in her designer silk gown and snapped cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. By the end of the week, the corrupt doctor who forged my evaluation permanently lost his medical license. The flashing sirens faded into the dark distance. I kissed the top of Madison's head, turned away from the window, and walked back into our quiet, peaceful house. The heavy wooden gavel struck the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed through the cavernous federal courtroom, finalizing the absolute destruction of my family's untouchable empire. The judge showed zero mercy from the bench. He sentenced Gregory to 23 years in federal prison without the slightest possibility of early parole. The massive list of charges included multiple counts of severe child endangerment and federal wire fraud. The court also ordered Gregory to pay $2 million in direct restitution to Margaret and her son, draining his personal accounts completely dry. Eleanor faced her own spectacular ruin. The woman who spent her entire adult life viciously polishing her public image received a 4-year sentence in a minimum security federal correctional facility for obstruction of justice and corporate financial crimes. But the prison sentence barely registered on her face. The true lethal blow came directly from the federal prosecutors. Utilizing aggressive civil asset forfeiture laws, the government seized the entire $85 million family trust fund. They froze the offshore accounts. They auctioned the grand historic estate. The source of her dark power evaporated overnight. The social fallout was absolute and merciless. The board of directors at Oak Creek Private School voted unanimously to dissolve the institution rather than face the massive public relations nightmare. Eleanor's elite country club quietly revoked her lifetime membership within 48 hours of her highly publicized arrest. During the agonizing 6-week trial, the gallery benches directly behind my mother remained completely empty. The billionaire friends, the local politicians she funded, the relatives she paid off, every single one of them vanished like smoke in a hurricane. They abandoned her the second her money dried up. The pristine legacy she sacrificed her own granddaughter to protect was reduced to a sordid cautionary tale on the evening news. 8 months passed. The crisp autumn air rolled into our new neighborhood. I stood by my kitchen island, sorting through the morning mail, when a plain white envelope caught my eye. The return address bore the sterile stamped ink of a federal correctional institution. It was a letter from Eleanor, 3 pages of tightly cramped, furious handwriting. She offered absolutely zero apologies for Madison's bruised ribs. Instead, she poured out a pathetic stream of guilt and toxic manipulation. She complained bitterly about her failing health and the terrible prison food. She reminded me of the expensive roof she provided over my head for 18 years. She ended the letter with a desperate, venomous plea. "I am still your mother. I did what I had to do for our legacy. You destroyed this family, Kelly. You need to fix this." A year ago, those exact words would have sent me into a devastating spiral of crippling guilt. I would have spent days agonizing over my inherent worth. Today, my pulse remained completely steady, my breathing stayed slow and perfectly calm. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman who wrote those words. I folded the 3 pieces of paper, walked over to the corner of my home office, and fed the entire envelope directly into the steel blades of the paper shredder. The machine hummed loudly, grinding her final attempt at psychological control into meaningless strips of white confetti. I tossed the scraps into the recycling bin, walked back into the bright kitchen, and poured myself a cup of hot coffee. I carried my mug out to the back porch. The morning sun warmed the wooden deck. Madison sat in the middle of the green lawn, giggling uncontrollably as my shift supervisor from the dispatch center chased her around the yard with a garden hose. The backyard was loud, chaotic, and completely full of vibrant life. Half a dozen of my coworkers lounged around a smoking barbecue grill, tossing paper plates and passing heavy bowls of potato salad. These people share absolutely 0 strands of DNA with me, yet when the nightmare began, they were the ones who showed up. They brought bags of groceries when my bank accounts were frozen. They sat on my couch during the darkest, most terrifying nights. They formed an unbreakable physical wall of protection around my little girl. I looked at the cheap plastic patio furniture and the mismatched paper cups. I compared it to the silent, freezing marble dining room of Eleanor's estate, where we ate prime rib under crystal chandeliers, while pretending the monsters at the table were saints. I have never felt richer than I do standing on this worn wooden deck. Peace is incredibly quiet, but it is the most expensive thing I have ever owned. If you are listening to this and you are exhausted from carrying the heavy, toxic weight of your own family's dark secrets, I need you to hear me clearly. Wealthy, narcissistic families operate exactly like cults. They demand your absolute silence as the ultimate currency for their love. They will systematically convince you that protecting their public reputation is vastly more important than protecting your own physical and mental safety. I walked straight through the fire, and I brought back 3 absolute truths. First, the truth about blood. Society brainwashes us to believe that sharing DNA requires unconditional loyalty. It is a lie. DNA is merely a biological coincidence. Safety, respect, and fierce protection. Those are the true requirements for a family. You are entirely allowed to walk away from people who actively harm you, even if you share a last name. Trust is earned through consistent actions, not owed through a birth certificate. Second, the weapon of sunlight. Manipulators and abusers thrive exclusively in the shadows. They rely heavily on your shame and your ingrained fear to keep their twisted empires running. The moment you stop keeping their filthy secrets, their power vanishes completely. Your greatest, most devastating weapon against toxic power is dragging it out into the blinding light of the public square. Expose the documents. Speak the truth loudly. Let the chips fall where they may. Third, the maternal boundary. There is absolutely no institutional corruption, no billionaire trust fund, and no social pressure stronger than a mother's primal instinct to protect her child. When they threaten what you love the most, you stop asking for permission to survive. You become the storm that wipes them off the map. I look back at the little girl who used to sit on the grand staircase, begging for tiny scraps of approval from people who despised her. She is gone. The fire burned her away, leaving behind a woman made of iron. So I ask you to look deeply at your own life right now. Look at the people sitting around your dinner table. How much of your own precious soul are you sacrificing just to protect a toxic definition of family? How many bruises are you covering up just to keep the peace? If you have ever had to walk away from your own bloodline to save yourself, share this story. Let the world know that choosing your own survival over a toxic legacy is never a betrayal. It is the ultimate victory.